All right, welcome. My name is Trey Combs. This is an introduction to ASP.NET MVC. An overview of the discussion, we'll be talking about what MVC is, a history of MVC, we'll compare MVC to web forms, and then start getting into a little more technical information regarding MVC's architecture and some code examples of some MVC concepts. Finally, I'll draw a few conclusions, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. So if you have any questions, please try and hold them until then. Briefly, what you can expect is the first half of this will be geared more toward a business discussion, and the second half will be geared more towards a technical discussion. So what is MVC? ASP.NET MVC is a number of things. First, it's a design pattern. It's also a framework, and it's also an alternative to web forms. So what do I mean when I say it's a design pattern? A design pattern is very simply just a reusable solution to a common programming problem. One very simple common programming problem is, where do you put the code? Do you put it all in one big file? Do you split it into lots of little files? If so, what code goes where? MVC is a solution that dictates how to arrange your code in different areas depending on what that code is doing. So that's how it's like a design pattern, or it is a design pattern. MVC is also a framework. You can think of a framework the way a home builder might think of a framed-in house. It may just be the stud walls and maybe some plumbing or some electricity. At this point, the home builder is going to go about making the house whatever unique product it needs to be for its client. In the same way, a developer can use a framework to focus on developing the unique business requirements of any specific client that they're working on, instead of having to worry about the plumbing and the fundamentals that are similar across many web applications. Finally, it's an alternative to web forms. Up until now, ASP.NET Web Forms has really been your only way of developing a .NET web application. So this provides you an alternative. Microsoft defined MVC, or described it as the following. ASP.NET MVC gives you a powerful, patterns-based way to build dynamic websites that enables a clean separation of concerns and that gives you full control over markup for enjoyable, agile development. ASP.NET MVC includes many features that enable fast, test-driven development, friendly development for creating sophisticated applications that use the latest web standards. So MVC was actually first described by this gentleman, Travi Rainskow. I looked that up. That's the correct pronunciation. He was somebody who he was visiting the Palo Alto Research Center, Xerox's area, and came up with this solution back in 1979, and it was first implemented in Smalltalk 80. Since then, the MVC concept has been incorporated into a number of different technologies before it ever came to ASP.NET. In Java, if you're a Java developer, you may be familiar with Apache Struts or Spring. PHP has Cake PHP as an MVC solution. Python has Django. The most notable is probably Ruby on Rails. Perl has Catalyst, and then of course there was ASP.NET MVC, which we're discussing today. Monorail was actually a .NET project that was a precursor to ASP.NET MVC. So let's first talk a little bit about web forms. What is web forms? When Microsoft first wanted to get into the web development area, what they had currently was a bunch of Windows Forms developers. These developers were familiar with the tools that Microsoft gave them to develop in Windows. Those tools gave them a drag-and-drop graphical user interface experience. They could drag controls and tools from a toolbar onto a design surface and then control events that would occur on those controls. If you clicked something, if you maybe dragged and dropped, or if you selected a drop-down item, they would program code for that. The problem was there's a difference between web development and Windows development. With Windows development, the way that a user interacts with a program and the code that's executing behind the scenes is all in the same place. With web development, the user is going to be interacting with a web browser. However, the code behind is going to be on a web server. The two are completely separate. So Microsoft needed a way to try and edge some of their developers they had developing Windows forms onto the web. So they created a very similar experience that hid a lot of the things that made the web what it is. Instead of having to write HTTP, they created user controls and a design surface similar to the way that these developers were already used to developing in Windows. And they also hid the fact that information is going back and forth over HTTP by a couple of methods that we'll discuss, but the underpinnings of web forms kind of hid part of what the internet was and made users able to transfer from Windows development to web development without a lot of pain. Some problems or some complicated areas arose when things like the view state start becoming a problem for traffic. The view state simply maintains what the user selected. If you've entered your name and address into a form, that information is going to be stored on the page and behind the scenes. The problem is that stored information can grow to a very, very large amount of information. So as you're trying to send information back and forth across the wire, that can cause your page loads to become very slow, and that can be a problem. The page lifecycle is another web forms concept that can be very confusing to many developers. Without getting into a whole lot of detail, it's just a confusing mess of how do you tie into what you want to do during the page being processed on the server. It's confusing. It can be very confusing if somebody's just getting into it. So it's kind of a barrier to entry for some people. There's a false separation of concerns. A lot of code, you want to separate the code that you're going and getting in data from the database from code that you're using to alter the way things display on the page. With web forms, a lot of that gets mushed into one big file. That's not the best way to program if you can help it. There's a limited control over HTML because instead of writing your own HTML, web forms encourages you to use the drag and drop controls, and they create the HTML for you. And that can be a problem, as we'll discuss shortly. Finally, it's difficult to run automated tests against. You're just going to have to take my word for that because it's beyond the scope of this discussion. So some of the benefits that MVC brings to the table to address these problems. There's a cleaner separation of concerns. Code that is meant to go and get data out of the database and perform business tasks is kept separate from code that is used to modify the way that a page is displayed to a user. Things are just cleaner in their separation. The flow of information is more natural. Instead of having the page lifecycle, there's just a cleaner path for you to be able to understand where a request is coming from, how it travels through the system, and how you can tie into that if you need to. It's a simpler way to approach that. It's more extendable. Everything about the MVC framework is meant to be either used out of the box, or you can extend and modify it and then use your updated version that may be very specific to your business needs, or you can completely replace any portion of the MVC framework with something that perhaps a third party has developed. You have tighter control over HTML and HTTP. This is a benefit for a number of reasons. Search engine optimization is one, which I'll discuss in a minute. Another is it can also make the interaction between departments a little bit simpler. If you have one group of developers that is developing HTML and then passing it off to another group of developers who's going to be implementing the HTML and an application, this is actually going to simplify it because there may be times where, let's say in web forms, you're going to have some drag and drop controls that generate HTML. Well, if your HTML developers had written a bunch of HTML, half that might be useless because it's being generated by a control, and so there has to be some back and forth between the two teams figuring out what's really being used, what's not. If there's some things being developed or generated by a control, how do we style those? This gives you a much finer control over your HTML. It's going to simplify the communication interaction between those two teams. MVC is simply more testable. As you dig into the inners of MVC, you'll find that to be the case. That's very beneficial when you have something that really needs to be tested. If you're dealing with, I don't know, financial information or something like that, where you could pantsuit off of you if you don't do it right, you want to make sure that you have a bunch of automated tests that you can run against and find out, code that you developed 6 months ago, you can run a test and verify indeed this is still working even after all the changes that we made. The routing system of MVC is something that gives you control over the URLs, among other things. So you create very user-friendly URLs that are much more readable. Again, this is also something that is beneficial for search engine optimization. You can still use the best parts of ASP.NET. Just because you're moving from web forms to MVC doesn't mean that parts of ASP.NET aren't available to you. Things like caching or master pages, those sorts of things that are ASP.NET concepts, those are still available to you while you're using MVC. Finally, it's open source. Microsoft actually opened up all the source so you can dig into the framework and read through all the code that makes the magic happen if you need to maybe figure out why you're experiencing a certain type of behavior in your application. Here's an illustration I came up with, kind of describe the difference between web forms and MVC as they approach the net. Web forms, may say to the web that, I like you, but some things are going to have to change. Whereas MVC says to the web, I love you just the way you are. HTTP and HTML and all. Probably the biggest lesson I learned from this is the difficulty in creating a proper stick figure. You would be surprised how difficult it would be to get the dimensions in the hair, especially. So you would be surprised. All right, so MVC and SEO, search engine optimization. There's a couple key benefits that MVC brings to the table here. First, meaningful URLs. I'm sure everybody has been to a website where up in the URL bar there's a series of letters and numbers and things that mean absolutely nothing to you. From here I can tell that on the first item I'm looking at some sort of a product. It must have a product ID, but I have no other information about this. This isn't very meaningful to me as a user. You can see the second URL, product/books/ASP.NET MVC. That's a more meaningful URL to me as a user. That's also more meaningful to search engines that are trying to determine what is this page about. If you have a descriptive URL, that is going to help your page rank better in search engines. Well-structured HTML is another thing. Because you have a finer control over HTML in MVC, this is going to help search engines understand what your page is about. Imagine if you had a book that you're reading, and half the table of contents is in the middle, and then the other half is at the end, and part of the glossary is at the beginning, and the chapters are all mixed up. You're going to have a difficult time trying to read through this book and figure out what's going on. In the same way, search engines need to have some way of determining what is this page about. If that's a difficult time doing that because you have a jumbled mess of HTML, it's not going to be able to determine what your page is about, and it's not going to rank as highly for what you want it to. Finally, faster page loads. This kind of goes back to the mess of HTML that can be generated by web forms controls and the view state, which adds a lot of bulk to a page. MVC is going to be cleaner, it's going to be lighter, the response time is going to be faster as you go and get pages from the server. So why is SEO important? What you see here is a graph of the percentage of traffic that different clicks go to the different results. So the first item on a Google result, the top result gets 42% of all clicks. The next gets almost 12%, the next 8.5%, and the fourth 6%. If you're a company that's trying to live off of clicks, let's say you live off of ad revenue, and so the more ads you get served, the more money you're going to make. Well, if you can engineer your site in such a way that you go from fourth place at 6% to first place at 42%, imagine getting 1 million clicks for a search term. If you go from 60,000 to 420,000 clicks, that's 7 times the amount of traffic that you were getting. That will make a huge difference to the bottom line of any company that is relying on search engine optimization, for their web strategy. So, SEO is not something that you can just ignore or brush off. It really is a very fundamental part of thinking about how are you going to design this website. So here's a case study I wanted to take a quick look at. Jawala is a company that has a money tracker solutions, an online personal financial management solution. It was originally created using the Linux operating system, the Apache web server, MySQL as a database solution, and Ruby on Rails, which is one of the better thought of MVC solutions out there. They ended up rewriting it using Windows Server, the Microsoft stack. So Windows Server 2008, Internet Information Server, SQL Server 2008, and ASP.NET MVC. Now I want to describe a scenario to try and go along with this. Imagine, if you will, that Casey List gets in the morning, and he's reading through the news, and he finds a news release by Apple. And much to his horror, it says the following: "We couldn't have switched CEOs without a leader that was at least as good as Steve Jobs. We couldn't have done this without Trey Combs. With he is proven to be equal to, and in some areas better than, Steve Jobs." Now, I know this isn't realistic. If Apple knew how I felt about Macs, they wouldn't hire me to be their janitor. But this still applies. That sort of a comparison is a very good light on me if I'm being compared to Steve Jobs. In the same way, I want you to keep that in mind when I'm reading this. We couldn't have switched deployment platforms without a development environment that was at least as good as Ruby on Rails. We couldn't have done this without ASP.NET MVC and Link, which has proven to be equal to, and in some areas superior to, what we could have done with Ruby on Rails. Ruby on Rails is definitely a leader in MVC technology on the web. So for a company to have researched this and determined that MVC can stand toe-to-toe with an industry leader is a good endorsement of MVC. The reason that I bring up this case study is to address any concerns there might be about people that have maybe heard about MVC, they know it's out there, but it's kind of new. Is this really something we want to bring into enterprise level development? Is this ready for that yet? The point of this is to show you that yes, it is. Microsoft is very much behind this product. It's on its 3rd release. It's something that companies that have taken the time to compare this to other industry-leading MVC solutions have vetted this out and said that yes, MVC can meet our needs. So this is something that is usable in enterprise level development. So we're going to take a little more of a look into the technical side of this. At a top level, MVC stands for Model, View, Controller, and that's simply the way that you divide up your code. The model is going to be your business logic and data storage, so anything that revolves around business rules or getting data in and out of the database lives in the model. The view is all the presentation logic, how you determine what the user sees and how they see it. And then the controller is application logic. It kind of lives in between the view and the model and ferries information back and forth. The request processing, this may not look as simple as you think it is, but it's much simpler than the page lifecycle. What happens is a user is going to make a request. Perhaps they're logging into a page or they want to view a product. That request comes to the web server, Internet Information Server. That passes the request down to ASP.NET. ASP.NET is going to find whatever application this belongs to and pass it to that application. In the case of MVC, it then comes into the core routing module of MVC. That core routing module is going to compare the URL against all of the routes it has and find a match. When it does, there's a route handler associated with that route that gets executed. That route handler has information about a controller and an action method inside that controller that get executed. Inside the action method is where all the interaction happens between the view and the model. The action method is going to go and interact with the model, maybe go and get some information out of a database, compile that information into a usable format, give that information back to the view, and the view engine takes that and renders the view out to the response. And that's basically when all the HTML gets generated and sent back to the user, and the user then gets their page. So when you're getting started with MVC, it's a fairly simple process. You're going to need Visual Studio 2008 or 2010, at least the .NET Framework 3.5. IIS 6 will need a few adjustments. It works out of the box in IIS 7. You'll need to download and install MVC from Microsoft, and then there will be some blank templates and such that you can get started with right out of the box with Visual Studio at that point. So I want to dig into some examples of MVC concepts. This is going to be fairly high level. I'm not getting into the nitty-gritty, but I do want to kind of pique the developer interest into how is this going to be able to maybe solve some of the problems I'm working on today. How could I do the things I'm doing with MVC if I were to do them. So I'm going to take a quick look at route entry basics. I've got a solution here, and I'm going to show you the routes are contained in the global ASAX file. Here are all the routes. I'll just highlight one here. You can see this route right here is given a name, then a URL that's going to match, and a lot of things are wildcards. For instance, this will match anything that's one word slash word slash word. It'll match that if none of these match beforehand. And these are some default values given to anything inside of curly braces if those values aren't provided. So let's have a quick look at the route, and you'll see how that works a little bit more in a second. So yeah, I described that. Convention over configuration is something that MVC tries to approach. Instead of having to configure explicit relationships between different things like the controllers and the views, if you follow certain naming conventions, then things just work. And so this takes some time out of development. A quick look at that would be if we look at a dinner's controller. You can see if we wanted to look at the details of a page, and let me bring up the website so you can see what I'm talking about. If I wanted to find a dinner, well, where did my dinners go? Alright, I'll log in. I guess I deleted all of them. Alright, if I had a URL like this where I had dinners controller, so I did dinners slash details slash 72 or whatever. Okay, there it is. I did remember the number. Okay, I came to a dinner. What happens here is you can see this URL path, dinners slash details slash 72. That is going to correspond to the dinners controller, the details action method, and then the ID, that last item, gets parsed in right there. And what gets returned is a view. Now you don't see any HTML page being specified here. It doesn't say return index.aspx or details.aspx. It's going to know that by convention it will find whatever page matches this action method name. So if you look in your views, you will see there's a views, dinners, details.aspx. By convention, the framework knows how to do that. So it takes some of the wiring up that you might have to do otherwise away. So that's the convention over configuration aspect of that. Model binding is simply awesome. MVC takes information that's provided from a number of areas. It might be the route data, the query string, information provided by forms or uploaded as a file, and automatically populates the action method parameters with that information. So this is something that I think developers will appreciate. If I were to add a dinner, I'm going to show you how I would create a dinner. Right here, I'm going to debug so you can see how this works. So developers will think this is just wonderful, and other people will at least think it's neat. Alright, so if I host a dinner, this will be Trey's dinner. It can be today, it's a new dinner, some fake place in the USA, 7890. Alright, when I go and save this, alright, it goes next to the create method. As you can see right here, I have a dinner object as an action method. It has all of my data already in the object. I didn't have to do anything. I wrote no code to parse all the stuff in there. MVC went and looked at all the information from my form. It knew I was taking in a dinner object. It knew the things that the dinner object needed, and it said, okay, I've got a dinner object here. What information am I getting that I could load into this dinner object? And it sees all information on the page and automatically just pushes it right into this dinner object. It saves you a lot of time. It's a very useful feature of MVC. I at least loved it when I ran into it. It saves you some time and makes it it's a more useful way of developing. So that is model binding. Attributes, controllers and action methods can be decorated with attributes to perform additional tasks while the processing is going on. In the code, you'll notice things like HTTP post and authorize. Those are attributes on top of an action method. They do things like make sure that only a post is going to be able to access this create method. If you're doing a GET, you're not going to be able to access that. Also, authorize and make sure that only people that are logged in will be able to access this method. If not, that authorize attribute is going to execute during the request process and realize that you're not logged in and stop you from actually going into that. Action result types, that's what's getting returned from the action method. This is what's going to go back to the user. That's the action result. Often it's a view, so you'll see things like return view, but there's going to be times where you may return other things too, like a redirect action. So, if something doesn't work out, instead of returning the page that the user was expecting, maybe they aren't logged in. Instead, you redirect them to a login page. So all of those things are wrapped up in a set of classes that are called action results. And that's what you're going to be returning to a user. And that gets rendered back to the user. The view data and the model, these are ways that we send information back to the browser. So if you've got a view, for instance, details.aspx, it actually takes a type of object, a dinner object. Well, let me back step to this dinner's controller. I will find, all right, we have here in the details, I am accessing two things, the view data as a dictionary and the model, which is a special property of the view data. And I can get that an object. Those are the two ways that I send data back to the view. So here I've got a view. When I'm returning the view is already going to have this information. It's programmed to be able to access any information that's stored in the view data. So this is how you send information to the view. As you can see, if I went back to the details of that dinner, you can see welcome. I put that in my code. In the details, you can see I said, send out my view data, the greeting item from there, and that I had set over here. So view data greeting was equal to welcome with an exclamation point, and that shows up on my website right there. And all this information here about this dinner, where it is, who's creating it, all of that, I set in my model as a dinner object. And so then when I get back to my view, it can access that object.
Is there any difference the way you're setting the model there versus just returning?
You can also set, yes, there's no difference between, if you were to set the model right in here, you can also set it as, all right, I'll stop debugging. You can set the model as a parameter in the view. So if I wanted to return dinner right here, I could pass the model that way. This is just a way, when you do that, this is just a shortcut to setting the model that is that property of view data. So it's just another way of doing it. But model is ultimately a property of view data. So there's two ways to do that. I'm sorry? Okay. Strongly typed views, if anybody likes IntelliSense, having a strongly typed view is a real boon to development. As you can see, I have, my view inherits a specific class, view page, but it inherits a generic of that class, which is of type dinner. Doing this strongly types my view, and what this means is that when I'm accessing information from the model, I can say model dot, and I get IntelliSense. So if I've got a dinner object, and my model is of type dinner, then when I access my model, it already knows all the things that are associated with the dinner object. So I have IntelliSense as I'm going about accessing information that I passed from my controller to my view. I found it to be very helpful. Also, if you're going to be refactoring anything, it's much easier if you have a strongly typed view than having to manually search around. So.
Is there any reason why you are handling the mapping in a global?
The routing? Yes, that's just the way that the routing works. What happens is when the application starts, this is a static collection. So this gets instantiated once when the application is first run, and then after that, you're not able to access it. You're not going to be able to debug routes. But what happens in application.start is you get register routes right here, and then you do your routing table. And so because of that, you need to create your routing table in the very, very beginning. And you need to do that. The global.isax is just the correct place to do that. The which.config? Maverick. I'm not familiar with maverick.config. This is, and there's different ways to do routing and such like that. You can have like a SAPI rewrites and stuff to do it. This is just the way that Microsoft created ASP.NET MVC to handle this. They created a routing mechanism, and that's just the way this works. There are many ways to skin a cat in programming, but this is the way that Microsoft envisioned MVC using routing. So HTML helpers are going to generate commonly used markup fragments. So if you're creating an anchor or something like that, you can use HTML helpers to do that. In the code, it's a very simple thing. It's just going to look like something like this: HTML.action link. You'll pass it some information, for instance, the text you want to appear and some other information. It'll take that information and generate small snippets of HTML. This isn't supposed to be where a lot of business logic happens. It's only for small snippets of HTML that you may want to format and display in certain ways that you're going to do a lot. You can make them reusable with HTML helper. Partial views are ASCX files, so they're very similar to what you're used to working with in web forms. They differ from the HTML helpers in that you're actually writing HTML there. Some things happen with HTML markup. You're not doing it all in code. But those are just ASCX files, and they have the same benefits that views get. You can strongly type them to them, and they work with models and such. Data annotations decorate model objects, and that information is used by the view when it's displaying things. So for instance, if you take a look at the dinner object, it has a bunch of data annotations. For instance, it'll have things like required and string length. And these things will be used by the model when it's doing validation and that sort of thing. This is just extra information that you can pass on as you're going. So you'll see in the websites, if I try and host a dinner and I don't provide certain information, like any of this information, it's going to say things like title is required. Well, that came from up here at the top, title is required. This is a data annotation. You can focus on things like validation and things that you want to be nailing down in your model by just decorating that with an annotation, and that'll follow it all the way to the view and be enforced by things like the authentication, by validation and such that happens. And there's more to it, but that's just a very simple version. Yes?
You would much rather utilize the validation paired up with an MVC setup rather than any kind of jQuery.
You can do client-side. This validation right here happens on the server and then gets passed back. When I tried to post this back, the validation happened. And you can also do client-side validation if you want, and so it doesn't necessarily rule out client-side validation.
I was just wondering, since I know that you have done a lot of jQuery as well as MVC, so I didn't adapt them both, and I just didn't know if you felt one way or another, like a stronger preference, like it's easier. I
feel like you should at least do this, just because there will be times where perhaps somebody doesn't have JavaScript enabled. You want to make sure that you've locked down your form so that that information can't get to the server. If JavaScript isn't enabled, and if you only have the JavaScript validation, a user could send bad information up if you also aren't guarding against it on the server side. And so I like doing this as a first line of defense, and then I'll do JavaScript if I need to. But I prefer this, and it's a very simple way of implementing it with MVC. Validation. MVC has some built-in validation support, so it's going to check requirements regarding the presence and formatting of data that's being entered into and submitted back to the server. We took a brief look at that. I will be doing a deeper dive into MVC for people who are interested, and I can dig into this a lot more. It's very interesting, but just know that out of the box it comes with built-in support for validation. Finally, the model state is working with validation, so it ensures the information regarding the model being things that you're, the model on the client side that you're sending back and forth, that information is kept around so you can return useful information to the user. So for instance, in the websites, you can see all this information right here. That is information that was retained and sent back, by the model state. Some conclusions regarding web forms. It's excellent for rapid development. If you're doing something that you need to get something out the door quickly, and you're just, it's a very vanilla application, and you're connecting to databases, maybe data binding to a list view or something, you're not going to get faster development than with web forms. It's built for that. It's going to be able to do it very efficiently. That's where I feel like web forms shines. There's also a lot of work that's been done by Microsoft and third parties to develop rich controls. So you have controls that are going to be able to deliver very useful information to the client, just dragging and dropping them. It would make a lot more sense to use those sometimes than to try and roll all the HTML yourself, if it fits that specific mold. It's very easy to transition from Windows forms because web forms was created to be so similar to it. And finally, there's a very large community of developers already around web forms. MVC is a great option for custom solutions when dragging and dropping isn't going to meet the need, or you'd have to really heavily customize it. You may want to think about using MVC. It's something that's very easily testable. It provides SEO-friendly URLs, and you can also very easily make this a RESTful solution if you're working with REST URLs. It's clean and extendable. The MVC framework again gives you something where you can plug in anything you want into it in place of its control. If you want to replace the view engine, you can replace that. If you want to replace the routing mechanism, you can replace that. All of the different parts of MVC are extendable and replaceable. It also, like my comic pointed out, follows the stateless nature of the web. It realizes that the web uses HTTP, and it realizes the web works on HTML, and it really embraces that instead of trying to extract that away. So, any questions?
What stinks? Excuse me. What stinks about MVC?
What stinks about MVC? If I told you nothing, would you believe me? MVC is going to be, like I said, it's a little bit slower if you need to do something that's out of the box. Let's say you just need a super quick admin, and in terms of development, where it's very simple. You've got a database and some front end that's just a mirror of the database that the user can enter data into, edit it, and delete it. It's going to take a little more time to develop that than web forms.
Because why?
Because web forms has the built-in controls that generate all the HTML for you. Things are a little more tightly coupled in web forms, and so that's going to provide faster development for certain scenarios that are kind of more generic and out of the box.
I would say one of the challenges, I mean, the model binding is nice that you can kind of maintain the state from request to request. So you post a form with all the data, and there's an error, and it automatically repopulates what you put in there. But if you get a little more complicated, the view state's nice, where it keeps the state of every little thing on the page, where you don't have to necessarily repopulate that every time. Like drop-down lists, you basically have to make sure, like when you post back and you show the page again, you got to reload that drop-down list and all that kind of stuff. Make sure some things that are a little harder in that respect. But,
Mm-hmm.
you know, how to do it.
What about things like a grid view or something like that, where you've got, you know, not just a set of Xboxes? Is there anything available for that kind of solution?
There's not like a drag and drop control for that. I found that it's not too hard to create your own. Oftentimes when I'm creating a grid view or a list view or something like that, I find that I need information from more than just one or two areas, and it makes using like the web form solution a little more difficult. And so I end up rolling my own HTML, and oftentimes if I'm creating a solution that works with Ajax, where I'm trying to not always be posting back to the server, I find it's not too difficult if you've done it a couple times to know exactly what I need to facilitate Ajax transfers and to create this. Here's an add button, here's an edit button, write out a couple lines, and it's not simple, or it's not difficult to create your own, but there's no just drag and drop out of the box solution for that. There's no data binding and data sources the way that you would have.
And there is
some third party
step through sets of data or something like that to display proofs of data or anything like that.
There's I was going to say, like, Telereq. They have like a whole suite of controls for MVC there. So.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that. I knew they had a lot of. They're great for web forms. I didn't realize they had some MVC controls built out.
Yeah, kind of added those fairly recently. The funniest whatever, like somebody was complaining when MVC first came out, like where's, we don't have a repeater control. What do we do? And the answer to that was, we have a repeater control. It's called forward.
Yeah. So I mean, their facilities for just living and dumping out.
You're right. You would put a forward because it's not going to be a control per se.
Mm-hmm. But there's still facilities.
Yeah, you'll in MVC you do all the code you're going to be writing is inline on the page, and I know for me that felt very weird at first coming from web forms because I'm used to manipulating the page from the code behind. And it seems almost like a no-no, a little bit taboo to be writing all of your code inline on the page. I kind of rebelled against that at first, but once I read through it and understood the process, it's the purpose of code is any server-side code on the ASPX page is going to be just a very simple way of displaying information to the user. You don't want to get anything more complicated than maybe an if or a for each loop. Very, very simple logic, but you're encouraged to use C# or VB.NET as a way of on the page as a way of doing things like that, iterating over anything.
Now, aren't there different rendering, or I can't think of words I'm looking for.
View agents.
Yeah, so you can like code or like pseudocode, and like I think the Razor's one of them I've heard of, or something like that.
Yep.
So how does that fit into this bigger picture?
It's something where you can override the view engine either on a page level or for the whole application, and what that's going to do is it'll allow you to use whatever syntax that view engine supports. So instead of using the web forms view engine, which uses web form syntax, where you'd have like less than %, similar to what you see right here. Instead of using things like this that are products of the web forms view engine, there are people that have created view engines that have a more readable syntax. It's more concise at times, and it just flows better. And so it's kind of like pick your poison as far as how you would like to begin coding HTML and how your server code interacts with that. Because you're doing all of your server coding in line, it makes sense to maybe look into that because there's no code behind. So people have created view engines to facilitate easier coding.
How much of a separation is there on the presentation layer so that designers can adjust the look without the programmer having to implement their changes? Is there any type of separation there?
Well, yeah, because there isn't any code behind where programmers are meddling with the page. Everything is HTML and then some bit of code here. If especially if your HTML developers have a bit of a grasp on MVC concepts like there's going to be a model and view data and such, they can write out all the HTML, and instead of they can put in a false title or whatever here, or something like title, and with the knowledge that the model is going to have the information that's going to be inserted in there. So when as long as they know what's going to be available to the programmer, when they start programming the page, they can just write all their HTML out, and then the programmer comes in and says, okay, I've got all HTML I need. Now I go in and insert information from my model where it's needed. But when you're creating things like repeaters and such, instead of maybe a HTML developer having written a table and styled it up and everything, and then found out that, oh wait, a list view is being used here, so all my HTML that I wrote for this table is worthless, and all the CSS I wrote for this table now needs to be adapted for this list view. Instead, they can just write out the HTML for the table, and then the programmer says, okay, here's one line from the table. I'm going to grab that HTML, put it inside my for each loop, iterate over it. But it's very, very easy to take the HTML written by an HTML developer and integrate that directly into here, because there's not.
The other thing, I mean, if you have a CSS style that's particular to an ID, like they're like div ID share, if, you can actually rely on that ID staying the same versus a web form where it's just generated ID from.
Yeah, anything that's running at the server gets mangled when.
So you can actually, that's another advantage, I guess, from a designer perspective.
I agree too, because adding styles, I just have to plug in my style sheet really, because all the HTML is already written in the way that one of our HTML guys can deliver it to us.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so much easier than kind of like what Gary was mentioning, like you have all these crazy IDs that .NET creates, and here it's just you plug in the style sheet and reference it. I mean, I found it's a lot easier than the normal .NET way,
Me too. Were there any other questions, or did anybody on the phone have any questions? If anybody's left on the phone. All right.
One last thing, Jay.
Mm-hmm.
For the .NET, series or sequence,
The processing.
Yeah, the life cycle. We need to incorporate your AJAX calls and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever have to fight with, when things were going to execute? I mean, does MVC make it?
MVC is awesome for AJAX calls. You can create AJAX. You can create just libraries of action methods and things that create like an API for AJAX. Because when you create an AJAX call, you're going to be calling out to a specific URL. So I can say my URL could be dinners/add, and then I'm passing up this set of information, either a serialized form or however I'm doing it, and I can just map those very easily to whatever action method I have. I've found it to be a lot easier to work with AJAX and MVC than in web forms. You can create page methods in web forms, but MVC is I feel like a much more natural fit when it comes to working with AJAX.
Yeah, they have their own. There's the Microsoft MVC AJAX JavaScript library that kind of come out of the box, wire all those things up, so you
Mm-hmm.
usually have some AJAX dot action or whatever, so you actually have a little AJAX connection on the page that generates.
Yep.
Although I find some people kind of shy away from that and want to do everything with jQuery and don't use the stuff. So.
Yeah. It is. They provide a lot of libraries, even for things like client-side validation, right out of the box if you want to use it. So Microsoft has provided a lot of JavaScript functionality that's tailored to MVC.
Yeah, because even working on the web project that I am now, like I'm wanting to use this framework. Like so part of mine, like the model and the view and the services were part of it. I utilize it, but it's based on the 4.0 framework.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not actually using MVC, but I'm my tendency is wanting to use this. I think that it would make my life a lot easier because I don't have to fight with, you know, the Ajax codes, and then getting confused with the life cycle for the code behind. So I know you helped me out a lot with that, but I was really fighting with it and knowing the natural order of things. So I think
I feel like that
my preference would have been
if you get into some advanced scenarios with web forms, I think, at least with my experience, there's times where I feel like I'm fighting against the web forms framework to try and get things done. And so that's why, because MVC approaches the web as a stateless thing that works with HTTP, I feel like when you're doing web development, you don't really have to fight against the framework as much because the framework is working with, the dynamic that is the web.
Did you talk about the how routing has kind of carried over and any other features that moved over from the ASP.NET?
Routing is something that they created when they created MVC. However, they created it with the idea that they wanted it to be used outside of MVC if people wanted to. At this point, routing does live in a library that can be used by any ASP.NET project. You can incorporate routing, the routing module, into a normal web forms application if you like. The way that MVC has this map route feature, which brings some MVC notions into it. In MVC you need to have a controller and an action, but these things aren't necessary in the routing mechanism. They're just things that are MVC notions that have been made part of this framework. You can use routing outside of MVC and put anything you want in in the defaults right here and use it elsewhere. It's just not it's a little more work to integrate, but it is something that is available to you if you know that you've already got a web forms project. It's going to be a web forms project. You can't change that, but you see some useful features of routing. That is something that you can use.
And actually, sorry, I'm losing my voice. Some stellar programmer, I don't know who it was, wrote a really good configuration library for that lives in TFS in the Ironworks namespace. And so you can just specify an XML file that will, and then you need one very small call in the global ASAX. It'll do everything for you.
Create that route table and everything. Okay, very cool. Yeah, and that is a solution if you want to store things in XML or in a database. Because I know I've been at or worked on solutions where they wanted an internal end user to be able to add and modify some routes. Or portions of the routes at least, and so storing all those routes, the routing information in the database, reading it out of the database and parsing it out here, and then adding it to the routes collection is another way to do it, and it can definitely simplify that process.
Another question: do you have your ear to the ground as far as new stuff that might be coming up that might be cool, like just from a kind of business perspective, things that might be coming along that?
The MVC3 book is actually coming out. I'm looking forward to that coming out. I haven't. A-Press is the company I prefer. I read their 2-book MVC2. So I don't have any specific information except for Garrett had actually linked a pretty cool article that Scott Guthrie had written, which had some pretty cool tools. Regarding tools for ASP.NET MVC, things that made working with HTML5 and such very natural. It's going to have things like has a JavaScript library kind of built in to make sure that if you're writing HTML5 and using styles for that it's backwards compatible even with browsers like IE6 and such. So there's
options. I guess create a view. It'll generate a template for spit out like a list. If you tell it a listing of something or details, it'll spit that out. Like they added, it'll actually generate HTML5 specify.
Yeah, and it's just more semantic markup for anybody who's not too familiar with HTML5. Instead of just having divs and spans, which don't necessarily say a whole lot about something. I could have a div that's surrounding an address and a div that's surrounding a biography, and it's the same div. It's not very descriptive. Whereas there are more descriptive things like listings and tags, new tags that have been added to HTML5. yeah, to make the, what's going on the page more descriptive. And that also is going to help with search engines trying to figure out, again, what is this page about,
Is that MVC3 or is that MVC next?
That's MVC3.
Microsoft got any sort of roadmap for
I'm not sure. I'll say I've been remiss in being a little bit heads down in some other things, but.
I don't know if you were Scott got pretty much into that position. He's not leaving Microsoft. Go.
Huh. He will be missed.
Yeah. Leading all MVC stuff.
Yep. Yeah, Scott Gu has a blog that's, if you do want to follow that, it's an excellent resource for MVC related information.
Yeah, his first few articles on MVC were just really, really good in terms of just a base ground level, trying to understand what's going on with it, what they were doing. They're actually really, really good.
Just let everybody know. Maverick, I never heard of it. I had never heard of it until Ty mentioned it. But there is like a beta version for Maverick. It's an MVC framework. Well, this is their site for it, but it says that Maverick is a lightweight open source framework that enables MVC patterns in JavaScript in a smart way. So I guess apparently you can ground it, I guess. So that's what, so I didn't know anything
in the
about
Maverick
Maverick.
config file, actually, like you mentioned in the global today, says
Mhm.
what view to and we can mention what controller to go and get the information from that controller and display it.
Okay.
And also we can create the views like the templates using the master pages as well. So the master page does not have a model information, but the views actually have a model.
Mhm.
So we don't have to recreate the content.
Okay. Well, it's something to look into then. But, yeah. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, then thank you all for taking some time to